Okay, so now we are having a roundtable discussion which will be introduced and chaired by Susan Kelly, Kojo Eshin, Lahire and Liam Scott. Welcome.
Okay, so welcome everybody again. I'm Susan Kelly, I'm a colleague of Ellie's from Goldsmiths. I was lucky enough to be here yesterday, so it's been really interesting seeing the films and sort of complexify actually a lot of the discussions we had yesterday. If people are comfortable where they are, that's fine, but there's also quite a bit of space around the table. I can't always see everybody behind pillars, so if you have a question to ask and I can't see you, just dance or shout or something. First, I'd like to introduce our speakers. So on my far left, we have Liam Scott, who is coming from Kingston as opposed to Stockholm, which is what it says on the back of his book. So Liam was born in England, and it was the possibility of nuclear war that prompted his parents to move to Hobart in Australia, which he calls the end of the earth. Liam studied and researched and taught philosophy at the University of Tasmania, and then eventually he moved back to the UK, where he is now a researcher and a PhD student at the University of Kingston. So Liam's been studying and researching various end-of narratives, including the nuclear narrative, and his recent book that's just come out with Zero is Nuclear Futurism, the work of art in the age of remainderless destruction. So Liam is sort of our conversant here. We have two filmmakers from this morning whose work you've seen. So Kojo Eshin to my left is a writer and a theorist and a filmmaker. He's one half of the Otolith group, who were established with Angelica Sagar in 2002, nominated for the Turner Prize a few years ago. You might know some of their other work. So the practice of the Otolith group isn't just filmmaking, it's also curating and publishing. They research into oral and visual cultures, a lot of work around moving image archives, and really investigating the sort of idea of the historical promise, I would say, the historical promise of film, of modernism, and in this instance of nuclear energy. So you saw this morning the film that was commissioned for Documenta in 2012, The Radiant. Okay, and then in the centre we have Mark Ariel Waller. So Mark makes films, sculptural installations, and produces events. He's also interested in archival data, the historical positioning of culture. The work that you saw this morning, Glow Boys, was made in 1999, partly made in the Oldbury and Sizewell reactors, after a year's research, meeting with and discussing with staff at the nuclear plants, which I thought was really interesting. It's not something we talked about yesterday at all. Actually, the culture of those places as workplaces. Mark has also made a film called Midwatch in 2001, where interviews with veterans of the first British nuclear weapons tests collide with Melville's Moby Dick in a psychologically charged exchange, so that might be one to follow up with. And Mark currently lectures at Central St Martin's and at Norwich. So I think what we're going to do, we have about an hour, and Liam is going to kick off with a couple of comments and observations about the films, not just Kojo and Mark's, but also we've seen quite a broad range of films this morning. They will talk among themselves probably for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll open up to the room for discussion or debate, unless you want to urgently jump in earlier, and that will be fine too. Okay, so over to you, Liam.
Okay. Thanks, Susan, and thanks to Kojo and Mark for the films and all the other artists, and to Ellie for organising everything. But I guess, my interest and the interest that the book was about time, and specifically the problem of the future in the face of these various end-of narratives, specifically the end of history that was so closely tied to the Cold War and that threat of nuclear destruction. And that's what led me to look at the connection between sort of the futurists as an art movement and nuclear weapons, because the futurists were keen on war and on technology, and nuclear weapons are sort of the highest form of war technology that there is. But that was just a way of getting in to explore this question of the future and of temporality. And what I think is interesting in these films is that sort of temporality that's at work there, and specifically the temporality of the disaster, or the time of the disaster. And so in The Radiant we saw exploring the after effects of this disaster. And I think that's interesting for the way you blended sort of documentary style of interviews and file footage, etc., and looking at something after, but also in the artistic work of creating something new as well. So there's that connection. But of course, you know, all effects are after effects, and in a way we're stuck after the disaster already. We're already there, and I think this is, the nuclear workers are already working in this disastrous situation. It's like, if they're there, it's like they're getting radiation, that the disaster has already happened, that they're necessary to be there, being contaminated in this. The disastrous situation is the nuclear power plant there already. But that, I think, connects up with something that we spoke a lot about yesterday, which was sort of knowledge and the epistemology connected with this nuclear condition. And not so much our knowledge of what do we know about the nuclear science or narratives or whatever, but how the nuclear issue affects what knowledge itself is. And that's what I would say is the important epistemological question, not what do we know, but how do we know and what is knowledge as a result. And what is it to have disastrous knowledge, or is knowledge itself disastrous? And I think there's an interesting connection with the Blanchot that came in Yelena Popova's films, with that mention of Blanchot there, and you know, that sort of stole my thunder a bit. And what I wonder is this sort of scientific knowledge that allows us to so in-depth manipulate, you know, the very matter of the world, the very atom itself. If that itself is the disastrous thing, that the shift in knowledge that allowed the science for us to do that, you know, happened long before nuclear weapons were produced, but that is the disaster there. And I think that's interesting because, you know, the knowledge that allows us to do that also gives us knowledge of the world that is well beyond the human. And this is sort of something I thought up yesterday, where there was discussion of how to dispose of nuclear waste, and in particular this long temporality that you have to deal with, this long time of, you know, 100,000 years or so was the figure that was quoted. But, you know, when science also tells us that the Earth came together 4.5 billion years ago, then 100,000 years doesn't seem so long. And I wonder if the knowledge that produced the atom, atomic energy itself, also produces a way of disposing of it, because it's that knowledge that is, that scientific knowledge, that gives us this really deep, deep time, much more than the half-life of atomic things. And that it's the temporality of the geological itself that will dispose of this. And I found that idea of geological disposal facilities, you know, interesting, because the geological itself disposes of the problem. If you think in geological time, there isn't a problem. It's much too long for this problem to exist. And into that, the place of the human is called into question. And I thought this was something interesting in the interview with the nuclear worker, where he said that this idea of claiming that you're someone that you're not. And the interesting thing is not, well, who are they? Again, we can flip that around and say, if you can claim that you're someone who you're not, what does that mean for the very idea of personhood or subjectivity? How important is subjectivity if it can be, it can also be disposed of that easily? And I guess this, in a way, is what I find interesting about the nuclear question, is that it is so crazy that we have created this, that after we created these weapons that can destroy all life on Earth, this humongous power source, it's like, where are we left after we have done that? but what is our condition in the disaster? And I think something we spoke about before was the way in which divinity has popped into both of your films, the divinity of radiation and the divinity of human mastery. But it makes me think, there is that, I think it's Dostoevsky who says, if God has died, then anything is possible. But maybe we can flip that around and say, in the face of the absolute craziness of the nuclear disaster, or the disastrousness of nuclear knowledge, it's surely anything is possible after that. In the face, nothing can be as bizarrely crazy as that knowledge. And I think that opens up an interesting space within which art can work. And how, in that juxtaposition of asking knowledge, what is knowledge, what's the documentary form of that, and what's the creative side of it? And because both of the films played on this, or Urals in two parts, the interview and the more, I don't know what you call it, fictional side of it, and the interview side of it, and they were intertwined in the Radiant. And I think there's some interesting things because that documentary form then makes you accept what is said there, but I wonder how much of what's presented as documentary is actually fact, which I think is maybe an interesting question. But that's the space that gets opened up for art. And if I was going to go on, I would talk about space as a term there in relation to time that we spoke about earlier.
Maybe, do you guys want to have a quick response to this before we...
Thank you, Lynn. Those are really compelling points you draw. Maybe I could pick up on the last point you mentioned, which is, say, in the face of the disastrousness of nuclear knowledge, then anything is possible. And there's a in the credits to Glow Boys, I noticed that the men were credited after their T-shirts. So one guy was credited as the Hulk, another guy was credited as Mr. Fantastic. And so these are names from Fantastic Four, from Marvel Comics. And so, and Marvel Comics, as many people know, were a kind of industrial folklore of industrial, post-industrial America, of kind of post-war America. And both America and Japan had these mythologies of mutation. And these mythologies of mutation are ways of managing the kind of matrix of energies that come out of the post-war era. These, the energies of the atomic, the energies of the psychedelic, the energies of the electronic. All of these emerge in Stanley and Jack Kirby's kind of cosmologies and mythologies and cosmogonies of the Fantastic Four and the X-Men. And this question of mutation, which I feel Glow Boys kind of weaves a fabulation around this question of mutation, is compelling to me because it's one of the ideas that also informs the Radiant. Eric de Bruijn, who's a scholar in Amsterdam, said that the Radiant, the term, that even the name the Radiant sounded to him like a superhero. And one of the impulses behind the Radiant was to stress test, was to stress these fantasies of mutation that we'd grown up with. Was to test this against an event which promised something like the horror of latent mutations that would only show up 10, 20, 30 years. So one of the ideas was to test this against its reality. And Mark, maybe you could talk a bit more about that aspect of fantasies of mutation, how the characters are somehow both personifying that and commenting on that.
Well, like Kojo said, these characters come from Marvel Comics, Fantastic Four, were transformed through a relation to cosmic rays, I think it was I mean, something that that we were talking about yesterday in one of the groups was the relationship that we could weave back to Ovid, to the Metamorphosis, and how a kind of an ancient mythology surrounding the idea of metamorphosis or mutation, and that this is the situation of being human, that we will, or being any kind of living organism, that we will change from one form to the other. What else do you mean?
I guess it's the idea that at the dimension of fantasy, the nuclear it catalyzes permission and possibility, so that what seems rationally and politically to be a question of horror and dread, at the level of fantasy becomes a question of permission and a question of potentiality and a question of the superhuman. So instead of a vision of dread and terror and threat, comics create an inverse fantasy of potency, of strength, of power, of unglimpsed of capacities. And in your film, when those fellows are playing darts, that having T-shirts with these Marvel Comics characters becomes a playful comment on that entire post-war fantasy of radiation as an affirmative condition, that humans, that these characters can not only survive radiation but can come through transformed, and that then links by kind of dialectically to the entire dimension of Japanese manga and anime from Astro Boy onwards, in which the traumas of Fukushima and of Nagasaki are transduced into a giant proliferating series of superpowered mutations from Astro Boy to Tetsuo to Akira and onwards.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of reason why I chose for these people to be wearing the superhero T-shirts was also, it was to do with the time I spent visiting pubs around nuclear reactors. I would stay in pubs where contract workers were staying and play pool with them and get drunk. And what came out was that the kind of this very macho kind of identification, that they were a bit like, they thought, I mean, obviously there's difference within, but there was a kind of culture of being like a cowboy, that you would go from one reactor to the other, and that it was that these guys were, through the kind of job, I suppose, they were unable to have a family as such, because they were always on the move, doing these welding jobs, so it was kind of just as much a kind of parody of their hyper-masculinity that they would arrive in this mutated form.
Maybe would you like to come back in on that, because in a way what you're talking about is a sort of a pop culture sublimation, maybe, or fantasy of the disaster.
Yeah, and I think that represents something interesting for what is that question of how can art speak to a very technical scientific discourse. And it can do that by ignoring it, in a sense. And it's like the superheroes that, you know, the physics is all messed up. It's not a scientific explanation or there's a pseudo-scientific explanation that Spider-Man gets bitten by a radioactive spider. That's not the truth of the situation. And in a sense, that is what allows art to speak back to the scientific discourse by having a different sort of knowledge. It can just ignore it and say, well, let's experiment on knowledge itself by presenting different sorts of knowledge. And it has the freedom to be able to do that, and in that way can not just escape having to try and be constrained by the scientific discourse, but comment back on it and say, hey, what's being presented here is a type of knowledge. Here's another type of knowledge that will maybe allow us to look at it in a different way. Yeah.
I think, you know, after a catastrophe like Fukushima, it's not very difficult to be against nuclear energy. It's very easy to be because it's clear to people how, you know, the effects and the implications within Japan and around the world become more evident. What was interesting to us was to revisit an earlier moment in which there was a great deal of pride and patriotism in nuclear energy, and to understand how Japan, which was an imperializing country, how Japan became the victims, so how the perpetrators of World War II, one of the perpetrators became the victims of World War II, and then how it was that after the war there was a kind of a concerted effort within Japan to reconstruct itself along scientific lines. So one of the things that the Japanese government took away from World War II was that the science of the enemy was superior, that American science was superior to Japan and Japan had to catch up. So right from the beginning, science is linked to the reconstruction of Japanese identity, Japanese political identity, and Japanese business. So this is why the film starts with this tete-a-tete between a Japanese businessman and an American businessman. There you see the two business elites forming an understanding which will shape post-war Japanese culture. The American man making a joke, the Japanese man speaking in a more British than British accent and making a joke at his expense. And that shared joke is something like, in that joke is something like the shared understanding of what it will take to reconstruct Japan. Japan's role as a geopolitical partner against China, and Japan's shared understanding of American techno-scientific knowledge. And it's all there, concentrated in this little joke. And so we needed to understand how it was that Japan had gone from this country that was bombed twice to having 54 nuclear power plants in a country the size of California, with intense seismic activity all along its coastlines and indeed through its archipelago. How was that possible? And the way you begin to understand it is that the Japanese government felt more safe the more nuclear power plants it had, not less safe, more safe. That nuclear power was understood as a form of potency, understood as a form of techno-scientific strength. And then the question also was that how was the nation itself involved in this? And this relates to Mark's point, as you say that you say that there are pubs that you visit which were close to where people worked. And in Japan, there was not so much pubs based around nuclear centres, there were visitor centres. And there were swimming pools. So every municipality that has a nuclear reactor also gains schools and hospitals. It's part of the redevelopment of the kind of hinterlands of Japan. So it's part of regeneration. So there were good reasons why why distant parts of northeast Japan would want a power station. And each of these power stations has a vista center, and vista centers are geared towards families and towards children. And this means that within Vista Center there's an entire pedagogy of nuclear power, which is designed to introduce and to invite families and children and mothers into the mysteries and the wonders and the kind of the powers of nuclearity. And it's at this point that animation and infantilization becomes crucial, because the way you make nuclear power, the way you make chain reactions understandable, is to animate them. So the key elements in chain reaction, uranium, etc., these are animated as playful figures that children can identify with, and these animations are voiced by female voices. And these are some of the voices you hear at the end of The Radiant. So these dimensions of the feminine guide and the kind of childish personification from Astro Boy onwards, these become part of the mythology that draws the nation of Japan into a sense of safety. And it was important for us to understand these questions of safety, pride, patriotism, and feeling protected by nuclear power. Because after the fact, it seems impossible. How on earth can you feel protected by nuclear power stations? Isn't it the reverse? Aren't you exposing yourself to danger? But no. It's more important to understand how people feel protected than it. That's just as important. We try to reconstruct that process.
That's a good point to open it. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Immediate responses to a lot of what's been said.
It's your turn.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll say something. Well, I suppose it's a take on this superhero thing. Because I used to work on a nuclear power plant, so when you showed that clip at Fukushima where they were lighting the atom, I was there at Dungeness when they did that. I was part of that team. And I've worked inside a nuclear reactor, with all the airlines and the paraphernalia. What strikes me about working on a nuclear power plant is that nothing happens. Absolutely nothing. For year after year after year. And the people who do this work are not, they're professional engineers with their families around. And nothing happens. It is the most boring job you can imagine. And then you imagine what it would be like to be that person suddenly faced with a Fukushima or a Chernobyl. And all of a sudden somebody who is, who's had a very quiet life indeed, has to become a superhero. And when you read the accounts of what happened at Chernobyl, and what people did and the sacrifices they made, some of them really did act like superheroes. And you get ordinary people just thinking, if I go through that door, I'm going to die. But somebody has to go through that door and find out what's going on. And he went through that door, and he came back and he told his story, and then he died. And these tragedies are full of acts of heroism in the midst of it. And I just think it's another angle on this sort of transformation from banality to superhero.
Thank you. It reminds me a little bit of what Paul was saying yesterday about this very particular sort of set of affects of being around kind of the low probability but high impact. What that is, the banality and the absolute disastrousness of that. What that means is that what it means to live that out in those places.
Yeah.
Does anybody want to comment on He was the guy in the canteen.
Yeah, I haven't. It's difficult to have a comment really.
Do you think that the superhero fascination was this sort of sublimation that Koja was talking about, or do you think it was more to do with that sort of everydayness that David's talking about, of that sort of everyday banality?
I mean, I think it's also got something to do with these people. You know, they were heroes, the ones that died, but they also were workers who were you know, part of an organisation that paid for them to die. So it's quite a it's a difficult thing to say, because in some ways they could be seen as being sacrificed. You know, that's another, that they're sacrificial victims, not heroes. I think that's also another way of looking at it.
And just to you know, as an addendum, in a way, there was discussions about science and control and containment, and the notion of science as an accretion of knowledge and ever moving forward to bigger and better. But of course, you know, the negative externalities, the problems that science brings, or certain aspects of science, you can distinguish between normal science, where the risk stakes are not so high, and what you could argue to be post-normal science. In other words, you know, stuff where if something does go wrong, there's low probability, high impact risks under conditions of relative scientific uncertainty. If something does go wrong, you might be able to write off a part of your country. So the notion of science is also, art has, culture has a lot to say about science and about the hegemony of science, the preeminence of science, and to question that. Because, of course, we're not talking about science is not simply one thing, it's many different things. And in this context, certainly science is contested and disputed as well.
I mean, I was wondering, Paul, did you have a comment? Because we talked a lot yesterday about knowledge and perception and sort of the uncertainty of science. And I think Liam's brought in this idea of knowledge as something that's dangerous, potentially, you know, which I think was really striking. Like, how did we come up with this? How did this happen? Just wondering your response to that notion of knowledge.
Sorry, can you say that again?
I'm just repeating in a way what Liam started out talking about, that, you know, that knowledge is something that's dangerous, you know. So
well, yeah, I mean, earlier there were discussions about the distinction between knowledge and reason. Also in terms of the initial creation of the thing, you know, to split an atom, or the knowledge that does that. In order to do things afterwards, you need vast amounts of resources, vast amounts of political, social, cultural accretions around laboratories, facilities. You need vast amounts of resources in order to deploy knowledge as well too. And in that sense, that's a cultural decision. So you can, what you seem to be pointing to are questions of ethics associated with science, perhaps, and questions of, you know, perhaps what you should do and what you shouldn't do. But equally, I think it's clearly a problem to think about science as an ever progressive accretion of knowledge, and also the notion of science being able to cure the ills of science is also, to be honest, it can be a little naive.
I mean, I could answer this and say, and present the sort of anti-scientist view that would have been presented, that's in someone like Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher. But I think that's like the extreme sort of view, but I would say that idea that science needs resources, I would say the mode of knowledge that science already works in is what allocates the world as resource. So it's already made that fundamental shift in the way the world is understood, that things are seen as resources. And this would be Heidegger's point, that you no longer see the mountain as a mountain, you see it as a uranium deposit to dig up. You no longer see the river as the beautiful thing flowing through the valley, you see it as the potential to be dammed and turned into electricity. And that it's in science itself that presents the world in a particular way and doesn't allow another sort of understanding of the world. And Heidegger's point, he says, is that science is, or the scientific worldview is dangerous, but where that danger is, there grows a saving power, and precisely the saving power he points to is art, because art can show the restrictive nature of knowledge as science and show the possibility of other understandings.
Yes, there's a question here, and then Dan afterwards. Yeah, I mean, Heidegger's biography notwithstanding, I think there are still some very serious issues, and I'll come back to something I said yesterday, which seemed as a refrain, which is that knowledge is not science, is not technology, right? Looking at a river, yeah. So that's why the violent inherent in trying to make a dam or trying to build things is not quite the same. It cannot be conflated entirely with unproblematically as science, right? So for me, it's difficult to look at science romantically as well as the flowing beautiful river romantically, right? I mean, that use of that adjectives kind of completely gives you away. So I think one's got to be really, really careful about this. Also because technology doesn't necessarily have direct unproblematic lineages in science, right? It's also got relationships to craft, to techniques, to making things work, to daily life, in a way in which what at least by mid to late 20th century, mid to late 19th century and onwards, we've sort of consolidated or began to understand this way, a certain way of knowing as science, right? And I think, again, I'm not trying to establish a hierarchy between knowing and knowledge systems and other people's blah blah blah. I'm not trying to establish a hierarchy as much as I'm calling for precision, because the minute you conflate these things, it becomes a problem. I mean, a dam. No, don't. I mean, I would have huge problems sort of forwarding that as an example for science, right? The bomb is. Yes, I mean, it is the coming together of big science, but it was put together by engineers, by chemists, by physicists, by military generals, by political leaders. So the coming together of organizations, as you say, the accretions, by society, culture. I mean, it's a collective decision of people often also maybe talking past each other, but it's a coming together of decisions of various kinds. And I think in order to come back to sort of, I don't even remember who how do you call it? Who put it together in a better phrase than I ever can, which is that for better civic debate, we need to work with sort of better understandings of science, of technology, of knowledge systems, etc. So I think I'll stop.
Do you want to come back on that?
No.
Anybody? Yeah. Can I
Is this working?
Yep.
Okay, there was one question here first, and then.
Oh.
Just a kind of question or comment about the radio. It felt a bit like a Keeler Robinson film, maybe like Robinson in Fukushima. And it reminded me of that last Robinson and Ruins film, where it opens with that quote from Jameson, where he talks about he quotes Jameson saying that it's easier to imagine the ecological destruction of the earth than the end of global capital. I'm not sure whether the Radiant's speaking to that somehow, or there's a sense in which global capital has produced the ecological destruction of the earth and of itself through that. Maybe, I don't know, because the way you were counterposing that kind of optimistic, positive archive footage of Japan building its nuclear facilities and the ship that went down after it.
You want to take another question or response?
Take another one.
Take another one. He needs to chew on it.
Okay, I'm an evil scientist, so what I am. But I'm not an evil scientist, and I sort of have difficulty sometimes when you're sort of saying, well, it was scientists that did this, scientists do that, scientists ruin the world. Well, actually, a lot of scientists are trying to protect the world and trying to look after people. And it is, as the speaker said just earlier, it's the society and the political environment actually that sets the direction that a lot of science goes in. And if you think of where the nuclear weapons came from, there was this will for war. I mean, that's not scientists. That's political. That's social. That's the people that we are. I work in health protection, so I'm a radiation protection person. I'm familiar with radiation. I glow in the dark, like everybody else does. And I find this is a very interesting environment. But there are scientists out there trying to protect people. For example, in your film, when you have the nuclear worker, sort of saying, oh, well, I go from site to site. Well, he may be feeling gung-ho about it, but I'm sitting there as a radiation protection person saying, well, I'm going to keep track of how much dose you've got. I will give you a passport, and that radiation passport, you write down exactly how much dose that person gets, and as they go from site to site, then it's recorded. So, there are people out there monitoring, people out there trying to protect people from themselves, in a sense. I think maybe when you think about your films, you need to think about the presentation of the facts as well as the presentation of everything else. Because what you're producing is something that people can see for a long time. Especially, think about the Green and Common film. That was a record, and that will be seen as a documentary of what was going on there. So, sort of think about the way things are portrayed and think about the facts.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that.
I think she just has one tiny point. Is that okay, Mark?
Yeah.
And then a couple of sentences.
Yeah.
Just a couple of sentences to add. I forgot one word, and you can kill me afterwards, because this is really not a personal attack on me. I hope you don't misunderstand me. The one word I forgot is capital, of course. Right? I mean, when does a river become a potential sort of site for a dam? It then becomes electricity. So capital and industrialization are hugely tied into how things become resources. So it's not necessarily only science. But the one sentence I want to add about science is also that, I'm not trying to say at the same time that, science is not complicit. I mean, scientists are also a part of society. As I said yesterday, artists are, right? So when you look at, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the hydrogen bomb came only as late as 1954. And at that point of time, people very well knew within the physics community and within sort of the other people engineers working with them, that this was potentially an incredibly destructive weapon. But as Taylor and Ulam, or Edward Taylor and Ulam said, this is a sweet problem. So obviously science is complicit in it, but that doesn't mean it's, that everything is inextricable. There are moments when it becomes something, there are moments when it doesn't become something, and getting to that and, holding on to what's specific is probably crucial.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Mark? Quite a lot to respond.
Yes, thank you very much for your comment. I totally respect your job. I think it's a very important job to protect the workers that are involved in nuclear establishments. The term glow boys, though, comes from accounts from co-workers at 3 Mile Island in the 1970s. So it is a historic thing, which I totally agree with you should be put into film, and I totally agree with you. Yes, it's a very good thing that filmmakers are giving accounts of the way that people have tried to usurp the systems that are set in to protect them. And no doubt people will find ways to break the passport thing. People, like criminals, always manage to steal people's credit cards and reprogram phones. And, there's always ways around systems, especially when there's easy money. so this is, it's a constant thing, but it probably doesn't happen anymore in the same way as it happened at one point. But there's always cases of workers who, in emergency situations, have to exceed their stated dosage. Like in Fukushima, there were accounts from a Tokyo newspaper, and it says, from the Asahi Shimbun newspaper, workers at crippled Fukushima No. 1 nuclear plant were ordered to cover their dosimeters with lead plates to keep radiation doses low enough to continue working under dangerous conditions. Some refused to do this, others raised question about their safety and legality of the practice, but the man in charge, as senior official of the subcontractor of Tokyo Electric Power Company, warned them that they would lose their jobs and any chance of employment at other nuclear plants if they failed to comply. I mean, maybe this didn't happen. The pocket-sized dosimeters sound an alarm when they detect high radiation levels. A worker who has been exposed to the accumulated dose of 50 millisieverts within a year must stop working and stay away from the area for a certain period of time. But obviously they ran out of workers. There weren't thousands of people in order to each go in for a minute to continue the next person's job. So they had to hide themselves from the regulation by covering the dosimeters. But the question is, should the company really have accounted for the dosage and kept their dosimeters going, and they broke the rule rather than the contractor breaking the rule? But these are very difficult questions.
Hero sacrifice.
You've got someone from Japan right now with the mic, actually. So
I just wanted to respond just a bit to both the radiation protection lady and to Danveer's point. I think the point you raise is a key question for cinema, which is responsibility to facts. I think it's a serious question whether cinema is best employed as a medium that conveys facts. At this moment in time, I think cinema, artist films, artist moving image has to be understood within an ecology of media in which social media and 24-hour news are, I believe, better equipped to convey facts, the kinds of detail-oriented facts that Mark just read out. I think are better served by television news, by radio, by newspapers, and by social media of all kinds, different kinds of websites, different kinds of blogs. I think the speed of social media and the resources of television and newspaper allows them to convey the kinds of facts that you are asking for. And I think the question of responsibility is not only a question of responsibility to facts. I think what cinema does, or what artists moving image in this case does, is construct different kinds of responsibility which are not only a question of facts. I understand why you put it like that, but I think it's important to say that the question of responsibility in cinema is more a question of montage, and it's more a question of creating different and non-linear relations to an event. The fundamental question is the relation of cinema to an event. In the case of Fukushima, for example, there's a hypothesis which informs the whole film, which relates to Danveer's point about Robinson in space, or Robinson in Fukushima. And the hypothesis is that there's a difference between an accident and a catastrophe. That an accident is limited in time and space, and that an accident evokes a feeling of fear. And against this, we can counterpose a notion of catastrophe whose dimensions are unlimited in time and space, and which opens up a dimension of dread. And this has formal implications, and the question is what is the formal relation to catastrophe, understood as an unlimited event which opens up a crack in time and space. This was the thesis that we tried to pursue, and this is why the film moves in between different archival moments, because it tries to say that to understand Fukushima, we cannot only stay within the fact of Fukushima. We have to travel back to the test detonations in Bikini Atoll. We have to move to moments in Budapest in 1970. We have to keep moving around in cinematic time and space to construct something like a cinematic geography of the catastrophe. And this essayistic dimension is why Danvir evokes Patrick Keeler, because this dimension is trying to understand this question of the relation between capitalism and disaster through a formal non-linear relation to an event, and this is just as important as the question of the facts and the question of evidence. It's just as important as the question of witnessing, the questions of testimony. This question of montage is crucial. And I think this is what film can do outside a question of resources, outside a question of speed, outside a question of an immediate response. It's to create non-linearities.
Do you want to come back on this? Or do you have the mic?
Sorry, there's somebody here for the moment, but if you
okay.
who was waiting, but
okay.
if you wanted to, it's up to you.
Is your point to really direct it back to the response? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Could we do that and then move on? Thank you.
Stand so I can see you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was just going to say that when I mean facts, I'm not necessarily talking about something like the news. Maybe that's factual, but that's ephemeral because it happens and then it's replaced by something else. What you can do with your films is produce something that's actually lasting, that is a lasting testament, memorial, or whatever you want to do, montage. I mean, I think that's the important aspect. And things like the Green Room Common. You have there a record, but it's more than just a record of somebody turned up with a camera recording the facts. It's actually putting it into a narrative. And I think my plea was when you're putting things into a narrative, your component elements, obviously research is the important thing to make sure the facts that actually make that montage are correct, and maybe, I would make a plea for balance because I'm a scientist and I like to see balance, and that's why I go into stakeholder type situations and places where I'm unfamiliar with the sort of environment, so I think because you can produce something that lasts for longer, and I'm very interested in this sort of long period of time and sort of how do we communicate to the future generations. That's what you can do. And the news will have disappeared. But you're producing something that can communicate to other generations.
Thank you. Sorry, do you have
thank you very much. My name is Tomohiro Shimada. I'm a Sussex University student in UK, but I'm coming from the government of Japan. So before coming to UK, I was working to support those people who are evacuated from Fukushima area. So in any manner, I'm very happy to see those people across the world, focusing on Fukushima accidents. So I'm very happy to see the first movie today. Having said that, I'm wondering a little bit that, for example, in your movie, how can I say, farmer in Iidate village on purpose remained the contaminated area while other people are evacuated. through this movie, some people think that, oh, Fukushima area is all contaminated and dangerous. But actually, yeah, as far as I'm concerned and supported those people, some area in Fukushima is still safe and not contaminated. And they're, yeah, in contrast, suffering from rumors about radiation, and their agriculture or tourism activities can't go forward anymore. So, yeah, just through those movies, it might be, I don't think it's a bias, but message might be sometimes subjective through movies, and only image that radiation is dangerous and Fukushima is totally destructive, like that. Those images might be rooted in those views, I thought. Or for example, yeah, some demonstrating people are against TEPCO's stuff, and TEPCO's staff couldn't answer well. But actually, as far as I'm concerned, yeah, some staff of TEPCO still sincerely try to deal with those evacuated people and try to compensate as much as soon as possible. So through my experience in working in the government, sometimes, yeah, information by the government might be dry and not unemotional, but rather precise or objective. And I'm not sure the word of objective or subjective is appropriate or not. But on the other hand, movies might be more emotional, but sometimes subjective and not neutral in sending what actually happens in those contaminated areas of Fukushima. So my original question was two points. What is the role of movies, theaters, or something only movie can convey and not other media cannot convey? For example, yeah, just this description through news or by government. This is one point, but if it's overlapping your previous comment, please ignore it. And the second point is, if you can avoid that kind of subjectivity in movies, when you send something about those nuclear issues, what kind of method is possible to avoid that kind of subjectivity? If you have a opinion.
I can say something if you want.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously art has no necessary commitment to facts. Otherwise, scientists should be outraged that Spider-Man is bitten by a radioactive spider and be saying, we shouldn't have these comic books because, you know, it misrepresents the danger of radioactive spiders in power plants. It's like, but I mean, I don't want to come across as like anti-science or anti-scientist. It's just necessary to understand it within a structure of what knowledge is and how knowledge presents itself. And art presents itself not necessarily with a commitment to the truth or as a fact, but the truth as the happening of the truth, I would say, which I think is what you came to with the event. And picking up on what you said there, and another way in which I would say it's not a simple dichotomy between art and science, is the way in which art, and in particular film, is itself a product of technology. And I think and something I'm curious about personally is the scene in The Radiant where the person takes apart the camera. Because I think that's, I just am curious as to what's going on there. What is the blue prism that comes out at the end? Is that the chip, the receptor? Is it? I mean, I'm just, and the blue is of course an evocative colour, and that's the blue of the cooling pools in the power plant. And so art and technology come together there.
Can we have one more response there, and then we have a final question, I would say.
Yeah, I think a way of responding both to your question and to Liam's point is to say that that in The Radiant we're not, we don't think the distinction between subjective and objective responses to events is not so useful to us. It's difficult to keep them apart, and it's difficult to have any definition of either. On the contrary, in the Radiant, what's really at stake for us is to reflect on the role that images play in constructing the sense that people have in common of an event which in some way tries to shatter sense. So the film has to find a way to construct a form of sense through fragments. And in the sequence that Liam mentioned, this is something like a dramatization of the limits of documentary and the limits of the lens and the limits of camera. The fact that the camera cannot read radiation, it cannot read hotspots, is dramatized in the most direct way. In the scene you see, it's a camera that takes normal pictures is being dismantled because we want to turn the camera into an infrared camera. The only difference between a normal 5D camera, normal Canon 5D, and an infrared camera is a particular chip. This is the only difference. In the film there is a continuous use of infrared, these black and white scenes, like the opening scene of Tokyo from Mori Tower on the 52nd floor. And the reason we use infrared is because light emerges in a powerful way. And the film has an aspiration to make light into an agent, light into an agency, into a character, into an agency which is not a subjectivity. And this is because light is clearly linked to power, to nuclear power. All the light in Tokyo comes from the nuclear power stations in Fukushima, which are carried along the power lines. So light and power are twinned. So this is why the film continually moves between infrared and normal camera. And in this normal camera, and in this scene, there is an attempt to turn one camera into another kind of camera. This class you see is not the chip, it's the moment just before the chip. The chip comes, it's not a chip, it's kind of filter that comes just after this glass. But this filter is absolutely innocuous and bland. But this is the glass that protects that filter. So that's part of what's going on there. It's a kind of dramatization of the limits of the lens. And for us, the essay film as a form is what continually reflects on the incapacity of an image, especially in a political situation, in a situation of high scientific uncertainty, which is simultaneously a position of political entanglement and political and of legitimation crisis. It's crucial to reflect on the role that images play. And this becomes a way of doing that. And this relates then just briefly to Danvir's point. While we were in London researching this film, we were really struck by the difference between the way Chernobyl was understood, which we remembered from our childhood in '86, and the way Fukushima was understood. If you grew up in Britain during the '80s, Chernobyl was immediately understood as a death sentence for the Soviet state socialism. It was understood as a disaster which exposed its citizens to danger, just as in Yelena Popova's film, this nuclear disaster exposes its citizens to danger, and these citizens are already endangered by their secrecy, and then they're exposed by their secrecy, and then they're exposed again by this nuclear disaster. So Soviet state socialism was always understood as a bankrupt system, and we were struck in Britain by the way in which not one media source ever analysed Fukushima as a death sentence for advanced capitalism. That Fukushima coming not long after the Deepwater Horizon oil spillage over the Gulf of Mexico.
Through, very deep historical mythologies, and economy and safety, and questions of time and the relationship between time and economy. So, for instance, in Glowboys, the reactor is a 24-hour operation surrounded by a public relations nature reserve, which has a diurnal time, and the guy from the reactor doesn't die because of radiation, he dies because he arrives in another time zone, which is outside of that economy. He goes from the economy of electricity production to this kind of slightly amateur economy of these guys going hunting. And so it's this conflict between two incompatible time zones which have their very serious economies. I mean, it's a comedy, but it's a serious issue, and this is the thing that I think is important to art, that it is, in its relation to serious issues, is that it brings in I'd say a panoply of things, which the Radiant also does. So this is the truth.
Thanks, Mark. We have just one more question or comment here from the back, and then I think we probably need to move there. Do we have permission to take a little more time on it?
I think we have to have these two.
Okay.
Yeah.
So two more question comments. Okay.
Well, it's a way of complicating the two cultures vision that's been on display, the scientific and the aesthetic. An anecdote I'd ask you to respond to. And that's, some would say that it wasn't Oppenheimer and company that invented the atomic bomb, it was H.G. Wells. The atomic bomb had been invented in science fiction decades before the Manhattan Project realized that. And so much so that late in the Second World War, the editor of one of the major science fiction magazines in the United States gets a visit from the government, and they're telling him they're going to try him for treason because he just published a story that accurately describes how to build an atomic bomb. And of course, the editor's response is to go to the back catalog of the journal and show the government that, in fact, for 20 years, Astounding Science Fiction, whichever journal it was, knew how to build an atomic bomb. And in fact, if you stopped publishing these stories at this point, any enemy intelligence service worth its salt could figure out that, in fact, you had invented the atomic bomb. Which is just to say that the vision here of art responding to a scientific reality, it's trying to scientific reality that art itself brought into being, in a way. So.
Thank you. Can we take Susan's question as well together?
Sure. It's more of an observation and actually follows really well on that comment by Dan. It's simply, I was thinking about films that artists have made around the difference between, say, representations of atomic energy and nuclear power plants versus films about nuclear warheads and, say, atomic bombs, etc. And I was really struck by a difference in representation from what some people might have characterized as the kind of sadistic metaphysics of atomic energy, or the atomic bomb that produces a kind of, like lipid, the film theorist actually calls it a radical avisuality, a kind of a seeing beyond sight, if you will. And so, anyway, I thought for me, it's been very interesting to look at these projects that are located not in a kind of transcendent sublime, but in a much more kind of immanent reality of the ground, and the ways in which, so we don't have a kind of atmospheric representation, so to speak, or that's not the dominant, it's not the kind of dominant syntax that's been kind of deployed, but much more an understanding of the nuclear as immanent to the realities on the ground, and including the kind of environmental realities. So it's just a kind of observation in what I perceive as a kind of shift in sort of representation or kind of syntax between the transcendent and the immanent, between atomic bomb versus atomic energy.
I think your point about science fiction's imagination of disaster is absolutely correct. If you look at a writer such as the Swedish writer Sven Lindqvist, he looks at science fiction's imperial imagination of bombing, and the racist imagination of bombs from the air, of warfare. Between the end of the 19th century and from the middle of the 19th century onwards, there's a continuous series of fantasies of bombing, These bombs are always directed at Asia and at Africa. They're always launched by European empires. And in this sense, H.G. Wells' fantasies are a continuity with the kind of imperial fantasies of terror from the air, in Sloterdijk's sense. And so it wouldn't be surprising if science was then to involve itself in that kind of imperial fantasy. So I guess the difference between imagination and invention is where science fiction turns. It's kind of perspective imagination, and then this kind of secrets, the kind of the mobilization of a secrecy of invention that then happens when the Manhattan Project actually finally gets going is really quite powerful. There's a certain sense which I guess science fiction has primed and has already set the ground in a kind of a massive scale. And I guess one final point is to relate to Susan's point is that I think there's a certain way in which a lot of the films that we've looked at are kind of landscape films, they're kind of landscape studies, because the question of the nuclear can never be contained in the question of a specific reactor or a specific power plant or a specific station. It has to include the harbour, it has to include the ocean, it has to include the elemental, it has to include the fact that radiation hides inside water, that it conceals itself inside the air, that the water drives it into the soil, that it enters into a kind of meteorology of elements, that radiation makes the weather into its accomplice, so that the question of radiation cannot be separated from what Minato calls the double invisible landscape. And then the question then becomes how film relates itself to how film constructs methods to make this double invisible landscape visible and audible.
Liam, do you want to finish off with anything on that? No. Okay, well, I mean, a slightly open point to leave it on, but I think...
I love that the openness was where we started.
Yeah, I'm thinking of those images from the camera, the black and white shots of the landscape in Fukushima. Yeah. Okay, well, I think that was really interesting. Thank you so much to everybody and to our three speakers.